Welcome. It is Wednesday, the 21st of February, 2024. This is the 8th Postal Weekly Live Room. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about drone privacy. When we talk about drone privacy, we're going to go into a couple guidelines. We're going to go into some guidelines for recreational use. We're going to go into some guidelines for business use. And then we might just talk a little bit about it more generally. What are the privacy guidelines for recreational operations? Well, there's not like specific rules. Like there's no laws. There's no laws in the Canadian aviation regulations that are in respect to drone privacy. But there are some guidelines that Transport Canada has laid out. And these are the best practices for recreational use. The first one is to just be accountable. You are the pilot in command. Ultimately, you're the one that's responsible for the data you collect. You're the one that is responsible for the drone you're flying. Try to limit the collection. Try not to capture personal data that you don't need. If you do capture personal data, you can try and make it anonymous. Like if you made a YouTube video and it's got someone's license plate or someone's face or their street address in it, you could try and blur those things. But ultimately, you want to limit your collection. So if you don't need to collect personable information, then don't collect that personal information. If you do need to collect personal information, it is a best practice to obtain consent. So if you're filming in someone's neighborhood and you're going to get their house in the background, you could ask them and say like, hey, your house might appear in this video. Can I get your consent for that? The next one is to store your information securely. So make sure you make reasonable steps to ensure that the personal data you have collected cannot be accessed by other people. You know, you don't want to get hacked. You don't want to get or to store it in a way that anyone can access it. So you wouldn't want to put it on just like your desktop where anybody can go in and look at it. And you also don't want to get hacked. And then you want to be open and responsive about your activities. Now, for me, this is kind of the most important one. So if you're out doing a drone flight, even if you're not recording, even if you're not capturing any data, if someone is uncomfortable with your actions, if someone complains that they're harming your privacy, complains about your flight, be respectful and courteous. Most shots are not worth a fight. If someone comes up to you and they're agitated and they're aggravated and they're spoiling for some fisticuffs, then you don't really want to be in that situation. It's always a best practice to just land the aircraft and say, look, I wasn't recording, but just to be respectful, I'll put the drone down until you're out of the area. That's for recreational operations, so not making money, just flying for fun. There are privacy guidelines for commercial operations. The privacy guidelines for commercial drone operations fall under the same privacy guidelines most businesses fall under, which is the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, or PIPEDA, as I will call it for the rest of this. Now, PIPEDA doesn't apply if your organization operates in Alberta, British Columbia, or Quebec, because these provinces have their own provincial guidelines. So in Alberta, it's the Personal Information Protection Act. In British Columbia, it's also called the Personal Information Protection Act. And in Quebec, it's the Act respecting the protection of personal information in the private sector. Under PIPEDA, your organization must obtain consent for collecting, using, and disclosing personal information. When you are getting the consent, they must understand the nature, the reason, and the consequences of what they are consenting for in order for this consent to be considered valid. And then there are 10 guidelines or outlines for fair information principles under PIPEDA. I'm not going to go into them in like super detail, but we'll just talk about them. So it's very similar to the recreational one. So accountability, identifying purpose, consent, limiting collection, and then limiting the use, disclosure, and retention. You also want some other guidelines is when you're asking for consent, it's done accurately. You have safeguards in place. You're open with how you're using the data. Individuals have access to that data of themselves, and that you continue to challenge your compliance. PIPEDA, though, doesn't apply if you're collecting, using, or disclosing personal information for purposes that are journalistic, artistic, literary, academic, or not-for-profit for charity organizations. Those are some of the guidelines for personal and then business drone flying. And we can get into it a little bit here. I see we've got a couple of people who have joined us today. Aaron, you're a pro in the biz. Have you ever had to encounter any, or have you ever had any issues with privacy in regards to either ground photography or aerial photography?
I've had issues with ground photography more than aerial, just because the aerial when I had the Mini, it wasn't so much of a big, I kind of just flew it and no one really noticed it. But with the bigger drone, I have the Mavic 3 Pro now, I'm a lot more conscious and aware. And because I have to go through a lot of the regulations to get the permits to fly it, it's usually not that big of an issue. And a couple times it has come up, but I've just explained that I'm legally allowed to be here, and no one's really said anything. But I've had more issues with the actual like still photography portion of it than anything compared to anything with drones.
It's always a challenge for photographers because like my mom was a professional photographer, and it's like, okay, someone's in public, they're on the street, they're eligible to be filmed, but there's something about being like the subject as well, where if you're the sole subject of a shot, then you should have consent obtained. But yeah, and for ultimately under the eyes of the law, they basically treat drones as cameras. It's all of the same regulations that you would, same guidelines and principles that you would as just a ground-based photographer. They don't really, it doesn't really matter from a privacy perspective. They're the same. Ultimately, it's the same tool, which is kind of like why like they say, okay, you have to follow PIPEDA. It's like, well, we're in BC, so we don't have to follow PIPEDA. But like most photographers, if they're doing like commercial photography, if it's not like artistic, then it's then they would have to follow these guidelines. And I looked at the document. It's like 200 pages. Like it's not the easiest document to follow. It's interesting that BC has their own for one, and Alberta and Quebec as well. It's interesting that they don't really care. And like this was one of the main issues with remote ID. This was like one of the things when in the United States when they were getting into remote ideas, people were saying, well, if I'm flying my drone and then someone's uncomfortable with my drone flight, well, they can now see where I am. And even if I'm flying legally, they can see where I am, they can see my location, and they can see my name, and potentially they can come and beat me up. It's not the best situation, and it's kind of, I think, one of the reasons why remote ID hasn't taken off as of yet in Canada, though it might in the future. But as long as you're following the guidelines, and ultimately, like from an airspace perspective, like if you got your permission, then you're allowed to fly in that airspace. And then if you've got the permission, you're allowed to capture what you're allowed to capture. And if someone's uncomfortable, like it's hard to not just say, well, tough nails, right? Like
most of the time I find it's just people interested in what you're doing versus them being uncomfortable with it. And that's just my experience. But yeah, it's mostly just people, they come up behind you and they want to see what you're up to. And that's almost more of an annoyance than someone telling me that I'm annoying them. So
yeah, because then they don't want to leave.
Exactly. And actually, speaking of the photography thing too, I find like as soon as you put down a tripod, people get like if you're just walking around with a camera, no one really questions anything. But as soon as you put up the tripod, it becomes an issue sometimes, and I don't know why, but anyways.
Maybe it's because if you're just walking around with a camera, they think you're a tourist or something.
Could be.
And then oh, now this person's a professional, this person's a pro, like they got the gear. Though I definitely have seen some tourists with tripods before, but yeah, so that's pretty interesting. Do you have a strategy to deal with people who come up and speak to you? Because in the past people have asked us like, what's the best strategy? And honestly, it's normally just like either put up a sign that says, please do not bother the pilot in command, or put up some cones or something like that. But do you have like a specific thing that you find helps?
I haven't really had too many negative interactions with the drone, but I do have, what's it called? That helicopter, little helipad. And I find with that out, I think people just think you're supposed to be there. And I think if you just act like you're supposed to be, no one really says anything. So I haven't really had any negative encounters with my drone at all. It's all been pretty much strictly with photography, and that's even pretty limited too. So it's just mostly like if people, I've had people come up to me and ask me what I'm shooting with my still camera, and I'm pointing at the ocean, and there's no way that they're in the frame, but they get, they ask questions about it, and it's like, okay, well, I think you're just spoiling for a fight at this point. So
we've heard from people like who've posted in our community and said that the people have come up to them and spoken harshly to them, and so our recommendation is like high vis cones, sandwich board that says do not bother the pilot in command, that sort of thing. Honestly, a high vis will get you a lot of places.
Yeah, I started off as a production assistant in the film industry, and I mean, if I live downtown Vancouver, so if I just wore that safety high vis vest all the time, I could eat for free for every day of the year.
Which of course you never did. You never did anything untowards with your high-vis vest, and we at Coastal Drone do not condone using a high-vis vest for illicit activities. So that's kind of the talk on privacy. It's honestly not a super detailed topic unless you actually want to read the regulations, but it's something that people ask us about a lot. We get a lot of questions. I have in the last, I've worked Coastal almost 2 years now, I've gotten many where someone has called me on the phone and said, there's someone flying a drone over my house right now. They're not allowed to do that, right? And you have to kind of go through and say like, well, from an airspace perspective, they're probably allowed to do it. Like they most likely have obtained permission, and you have to assume that people have obtained permission. And then from a privacy perspective, it's like, look, they are allowed to fly over you. They're not allowed to capture personal data about you. If you feel that they're doing something illegal, then you have to contact the relevant authorities. But those relevant authorities wouldn't necessarily be Nav Canada or Transport Canada. Those relevant authorities would actually be the local police, in which most people are unhappy because the police aren't really going to send out someone to investigate someone flying a drone over someone's house, because that's maybe lower on the priority list. But yeah, that's the conversation on privacy. If anybody in the room had any questions or any questions about anything, remember I'm a flight instructor. If you had any questions about anything aviation related, I'm happy to jump in on that as well. With no questions in the group, this is a bit of a quicker one. With just me talking, I'm not quite as verbose as Ian is sometimes. If you're watching this later and any questions come up, if you have anything you want to ask me about, my email is finn@coastaldrone.co, FINN at coastaldrone, just the one.co. You can also shoot us an email to info@coastaldrone.co, or give us a shout anytime. I'm happy to help with anything related to course content or anything that we've talked about in any of the live rooms. Otherwise, have a good rest of your day. Have a great Wednesday, good rest of your week, and we'll see you next week.